Okay, guys, so today you and I are going to talk about being explicit. So let's get into it. So I'm going to share a story from work and why you should always state what a value is, and why you should never, ever, 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 ever infer a unit. So let's get into it. So I'll show you some example code. So the other day I was working with, well, it was a while ago when this actually happened, but when I did work on this piece of software, the system that we had created, or that had been created, was a system that was built here in sunny Sweden. Well, it's sunny right now, and the people who wrote the software, it was basically an e-commerce platform. They had created a purchasing system where you could, of course, buy products and so forth, and pay for those products and send orders and all the normal stuff that you can possibly imagine. And the person who had implemented that had created an interface for storing a cost, the cost of a product like this. So since we're working in Sweden, well, we know that the best currency in the world is the crown, which is our system of it's our currency. And although that is, of course, very obvious to anybody who is working here and anybody who is using a Swedish system, yeah, not big of a deal. So we had a lot of logic that looked similar to this. Get savings or calculate price and so forth, and all we really needed to do was to do old cost minus new cost, or like whatever. Like we knew that we were in Sweden. And then a few years later, the system has grown, and all of a sudden now we need to go to an international market. And as you can imagine, that creates a bit of a problem. And the thing is, this massive oversight, the fact that we inferred that, well, if I have a cost, well, I really only have to store the number of that cost because I know that I am in a specific country and I know what the currency is going to be. That tiny little mistake created a situation that when we wanted to go through literally all of the records that we had ever created, we basically needed to update. We needed to convert this to something similar to this, where we would have to say cost with currency. And I cannot to this day understand how it was that someone decided to do this instead of something like this. Because the cost that we had to pay to get this value into every single model that had ever been sent out was, I'm gonna be like, it wasn't that all that high if we just consider the fact that we needed to run a batch job in a database and just add that value into all the existing records. But no. You see, we didn't stop there because that would have been too easy. Instead, we actually had tons and tons of business logic that was literally written like this. And as you can imagine, all of this is now invalid because now you have a secondary currency. So how do you know if you're actually comparing the right values? Well, you don't, because conceptually, both of these things can be true at the same time. And so the solution was pretty much to start thinking in terms of, all right, let's create a bunch of different services that know, again, which context I find myself in. Let's create a Swedish product service and a Danish product service and a American product, doesn't really matter, right? That was the next approach. And as you can imagine, the first thing that happens is that we have massive issues with trying to align all of these models so that we are always in a position where we can guarantee that something like this won't, like this logic at like just by just looking at it, it looks okay, because all you're really doing is that you're assuming that the old cost and the new cost here, like these things, they have the same currency, but you don't really have a way of enforcing that. This could be anything. And the problem, this problem continues to grow, and it's still a problem where the people who wrote this assumed that, well, the payments that we take in a specific country or a specific market will only be in the format of one single currency. But what if it's mixed? What if I go and find that actually we have purchase orders with different types of currency? That's a problem. So what we finally started moving towards, and we kind of arrived at, is that we realized that, you know what, we're going to have to store the currency, but we're also going to have to be very specific about the type of currency that we're dealing with when we're handling a payment. So we moved over to actually trying to say that, all right, we have a cost of something, but it is also in the format of something. And by adding it to the type system, we were guaranteed that we never by mistake made an incorrect calculation anywhere in the system. Because as you can imagine here, if I'm going to calculate the savings, it's really important that I'm doing it with the right units. And this is a much safer approach. And to this day, it took, I don't know how long to rewrite the whole system to deal with this from this initial state. So all I can tell you guys is really, really, really make sure that if you have a data type, if it's at all possible to store the information that you need in order to know what you're dealing with, put it on the model. A currency is not just a number, it's made up of at least two parts. It's going to be an amount of some sort, or a price is never made up of just the amount, the number. You have to add something like the currency. This feels, I know it feels stupid, and it is something that is so obvious when you say it, but this was a serious application that was built this way. And the way that we had to basically refactor the whole system was an enormous hassle just to arrive at something that was basically just an arbitrary mental mistake on the person who did this. Because the amount of effort to add this single field when they were first designing the cost model, it at that point it would have been nothing to do that, like a minute of work tops, and then this entire thing would have gone away. But instead, the model, the shitty model, persisted over the course of a growing system over quite a few years, and then by the time the system grew to a point where, well, oh shit, we can't actually assume that this logic is correct anymore. The complexity of fixing this problem was enormous. Now we have another example of how, well, a similar sort of problem, and that actually happened just the other day. And this was a different system, but on this specific system, we were dealing with, this was a fairly junior developer, and the issue that we had was that we started working with a customer who had different rates depending on electricity and so forth. And what's interesting was that the person who implemented the rate system had this idea that, you know what, we're going to, depending on what's most natural for our customer, implement different type of rates. So what happened was basically that we created, very cleverly done, he created a rate system, and there was a cost and there was some type of unit, because the customers wanted to express that, right, we have different ways of measuring if it's going to be in kilowatts or in cubic meters or so forth. So we had different rates depending on the value that we were dealing with. The thing that was really, really, really bad though was the fact that he never really restricted the unit. What I mean by that is that he never created, we started mixing from business requirement to business requirement, because in one market they wanted us to store the seconds, like they wanted the rate per seconds. And in another market, they said, "Oh, we don't calculate our prices based on seconds. We calculate it based on days." And in a third market, they wanted months. So what he did was basically this. He created a unit for each of the different types of units that were part of the requirement. And what very quickly happened was that there was an explosion in complexity, because basically that meant that whenever we were calculating these different values, we needed to always convert them. So if we had a rate we needed to calculate, we actually had to type check everything. We had to check, whenever we wanted to do a calculation, we needed to check, okay, so for this customer, like they are storing everything in months, and this customer is storing it in seconds, and now we want to be able to compare these rates to present a good offer to the user. Well, we are going to have to type check them. We're going to have to go and check, oh, so it's months over here and it's seconds over here. Okay, now we need to convert them to one or the other in order for this to make any sense, and then we can do the calculation. So what we talked about, and this is of course too late now, but I'm going to give you hopefully a little bit of a heads up that this can happen. When you're dealing with measurements, the first rule, as I told you, was always store the unit. Always. No, I don't care. Like, it doesn't matter if you know that this is always going to be the same value. Always have more information than you need, because the worst thing is when you allow your context to dictate what the state of the system, the source of truth actually is. It's much better to be over precise about a value, and then it is to have a value that does not have enough information. That's one part of it. But the other part is, how do you store that information? In what format? And my suggestion to you is pick the base value. In other words, if you're going to deal with something like electricity and so forth, pick seconds and say that, well, you know what, the only these units there are valid, and when we go to the display state, when we're going to show something to the user, but when we are working with it internally, we should use a model such as this, where we basically state that there is a cost to the rate and there is a single unit, and that is seconds. That is the only unit that we're working with. We're storing everything in seconds, because that is the most precise number that makes sense for this specific instance. Had it been, let's say that we were working in a cloud solution or something like that, and we were going to measure like clock cycles, well, then we might not be able to use seconds. We might need to have even higher precision. Or let's say that we're working with orders or things like that. How long is the wait time, or the mean wait time for an order to be processed? Well, it may not make sense to store that number as seconds. It might be better in days or in hours, depending on how precise you want to be. But make sure that you're damn consistent, because just because a customer says that, no, we want the information to be displayed in months or in days, that is completely besides the point. The system the internal system should not have anything to say about that. That's visual representation. All you really want is to make sure that you can calculate that correct number, and it's much better for the simplicity of your system to simply say that, all right, the lowest unit, the most precise unit that makes sense for this specific thing that we're trying to do is this thing or that thing. Don't mix them, because as soon as you start mixing them, then you need to start converting them at runtime instead of just storing them in the right format from the get-go. So what I want you to take away from this is, number one, always store the most amount of information about any model that you're working with. In other words, if you're dealing with money or costs or anything like that, make sure that you always add a currency. Make sure that it doesn't matter if you know that you're working in whatever country and so forth. Always store the value. Always. Never infer what you can store on the model, because if you can store it, it helps you with debuggability, and it helps you with future-proofing your application, because now you actually know what the value is. Because remember, your logic or your circumstances, whatever, the requirements on your feature might change at any moment, and all of a sudden, you don't have enough information. And now you're in a situation where you have to figure out a way to make sure that this thing that was always true, well, now it's true sometimes. How are you going to know when it's true and when it's not true? And then the second thing is, make sure that you're consistent with the way that you store units and things like that. Make sure that you decide on the lowest or the most precise thing that makes sense for the value that you're trying to store. and that you keep to that thing, because otherwise you're going to have to do conversions back and forth between something like months and days or months and seconds depending on situation. Just store it as seconds, and then you can do the math to convert it to whatever format is needed to display towards the user, regardless of what their business requirements are. Have a great day.